there's a prediction element, there's a iterative element where you're like adjusting your understanding of a thing by going over and over and over. There's a hierarchical element, so on. Does this mean it's a fundamental flaw of LLMs, or
Yes.
does it mean that there's more part to that question? Now you're just behaving like an LLM. Immediately answering. No, that it's just the low-level world model on top of which we can then build some of these kinds of mechanisms, like you said, persistent long-term memory or reasoning, so on. But we need that world model that comes from language. Maybe it is not so difficult to build this kind of reasoning system on top of a well-constructed world model?
Okay, whether it's difficult or not, the near future will say, because a lot of people are working on reasoning and planning abilities for dialogue systems. I mean, even if we restrict ourselves to language, just having the ability to plan your answer before you answer, in terms that are not necessarily linked with the language you're going to use to produce the answer, right? So this idea of this mental model that allows you to plan what you're going to say before you say it. That is very important. I think there's going to be a lot of systems over the next few years that are going to have this capability. But the blueprint of those systems would be extremely different from autoregressive LLMs. So it's the same difference as the difference between what psychologists call system 1 and system 2 in humans, right? So system 1 is the type of task that you can accomplish without like deliberately, consciously think about how you do them. You just do them. You've done them enough that you can just do it subconsciously, right? Without thinking about them. If you're an experienced driver, you can drive without really thinking about it, and you can talk to someone at the same time or listen to the radio, right? If you are a very experienced chess player, you can play against a non-experienced chess player without really thinking either. You just recognize the pattern and you play, right? That's system 1. So all the things that you do instinctively without really having to deliberately plan and think about it. And then there is all the tasks where you need to plan. So if you are a not so experienced chess player, or you are experienced but you play against another experienced chess player, you think about all kinds of options, right? You think about it for a while, right? And you're much better if you have time to think about it than you are if you play blitz with limited time. So this type of deliberate planning, which uses your internal world model, that's system 2. This is what LLMs currently cannot do. Well, so how do we get them to do this, right? How do we build a system that can do this kind of planning or reasoning that devotes more resources to complex problems than to simple problems? And it's not going to be autoregressive prediction of tokens. It's going to be more something akin to inference of latent variables in what used to be called probabilistic models or graphical models and things of that type. So basically the principle is like this. The prompt is like observed variables. And what the model does is that it's basically a measure of, it can measure to what extent an answer is a good answer for a prompt. Okay. So think of it as some gigantic neural net, but it's got only one output. And that output is a scalar number, which is, let's say, 0 if the answer is a good answer for the question, and a large number if the answer is not a good answer for the question. Imagine you had this model. If you had such a model, you could use it to produce good answers. The way you would do is, produce the prompt and then search through the space of possible answers for one that minimizes that number. That's called an energy-based model.
But that energy-based model would need the model constructed by the LLM.
Well, so really what you need to do would be to not search over possible strings of text that minimize that energy. But what you would do is do this in abstract representation space. So in sort of the space of abstract thoughts, you would elaborate a thought, right? Using this process of minimizing the output of your model, okay, which is just a scalar. It's an optimization process, right? So now the way the system produces its answer is through optimization, by minimizing an objective function, basically, right? And we're talking about inference. We're not talking about training, right? The system has been trained already. So now we have an abstract representation of the thought of the answer, representation of the answer. We feed that to basically an autoregressive decoder, which can be very simple, that turns this into a text that expresses this thought. Okay, so that in my opinion, is the blueprint of future dialogue systems. They will think about their answer, plan their answer by optimization before turning it into text. And that is Turing complete.
Can you explain exactly what the optimization problem there is? Like, what's the objective function? Just linger on it. You kind of briefly described it, but over what space are you optimizing?
The space of representations.
Okay, those abstract representations.
So you have an abstract representation inside the system. You have a prompt. The prompt goes to an encoder, produces a representation, perhaps goes through a predictor that predicts a representation of the answer, of the proper answer. But that representation may not be a good answer because there might be some complicated reasoning you need to do, right? So then you have another process that takes the representation of the answers and modifies it so as to minimize a cost function that measures to what extent the answer is a good answer for the question. Now, we sort of ignore the fact the issue for a moment of how you train that system to measure whether an answer is a good answer for a question.
But suppose such a system could be created.
Right.
But what's the process, this kind of search-like process?
It's an optimization process. You can do this if the entire system is differentiable, that scalar output is the result of, running through some neural net, running the representation of the answer through some neural net. Then by gradient descent, by backpropagating gradients, you can figure out how to modify the representation of the answer so as to minimize that.
So that's still a gradient-based.
It's gradient-based inference. So now you have a representation of the answer in abstract space. Now you can turn it into text, right? And the cool thing about this is that the representation now can be optimized through gradient descent, but also is independent of the language in which you're going to express the answer.